Institute colloquium. I'm Jeff Pasley, the Associate Director of Kinder Institute, and today we're crossing as many disciplinary boundaries as possible with a historian who writes about literature, who hung out with political theorists and European intellectual historians. So it just couldn't possibly be more appropriate and do all the things that we like to see here at the Kinder Institute, in addition to writing about all kinds of transnational stuff. So you could just really go down the list if you wanted to. Before I introduce today's speaker, Matt Crowe, just a couple of notes. Well, the good news and bad news. The good news is that we have a talk here, I think every week for the next 5 weeks, every Friday for the next 5 weeks, across many different subjects. Get in the 20th century next week, but the architecture at segregation in St. Louis with the great Colin Gordon. Then we have First Reconstruction by Van Goss about black politics in the 19th century. Then we have the history of copyright, and then at the end of the month, Laurent Dubois, the great historian of the French Atlantic, giving a lecture and a talk up here. So lots to look forward to. Now, the bad news for today is that, for those of you guys who are regulars, is that our logboat Pursuit of Happiness Hour has been preempted today because we have a seminar right after this. Our guest today is actually doing 2 events, only one of which is going to be on TV here. So those of you who are coming to that, you have nothing to worry about in terms of refreshments. But I'm sorry that that the rest it's a little different today for everyone else, which is really unfair. You can just pretend you're at sea. And someone has denied you. Some people get water and some people don't, right? This is actually not what Matt's going to talk about. This is the other paper. Anyway, it's been one of those weeks, y'all. Today's speaker is Matthew Crowe, Associate Professor at Hobart and William Smith College in Geneva, New York. And he is an incredibly learned historian who has written across the areas of legal history, history of the founders, and just sort of the sort of I guess you'd just say Atlantic political thought and culture. His first book was published in 2017. Thomas Jefferson by Cambridge University Press. Thomas Jefferson: Legal History and the Art of Recollection, and he has an incredibly interesting array of articles he's done, including probably the 2 most prominent being Thomas Jefferson and the Use of Equity in Law History Review, and Jefferson's Whale: Race, Climate, and Commerce in early America, from Journal of the Early Republic. Matt was educated at the University of California, Los Angeles, which is where he said he spent more time with the political theorists, which is how I feel sometimes too. He's currently at work on a project which some of us are going to be talking about later, called The Constitutions of Herman Melville, Law, Leviathan, and the Making of Oceanic History. Today, as you can see, he's talking about Jefferson's Ocean, political thought, and the Terraqueous globe. Actually, don't know how to say that, but I'll go with Terraqueous globe. And I'm going to turn it over now to Matt Crowe.
Oh, I grabbed your paper. That's your other paper. There we go.
That's not the first time that's happened.
Okay. I don't have slides. I decided against that because I'd only have 2 or 3, and I figured that'd be a long time. But that's such a cool image that I'm glad I don't. That's a cool thing to be standing in. So hello, and thank you very much for allowing me to be here. It's a real pleasure and it's an honor to be a part of reopening these kinds of spaces, and especially here, where you all come together to think about constitutionalism and democracy. In light of the challenges we face, I can't think of anything more important. And so I want to thank Jeff and everyone here at the Kinder Center for the opportunity to come and talk. I'm writing a book about Melville, legal imagination, and oceanic history. Whilst in some ways it's a kind of sequel to my earlier work on Jefferson and law and legal theory, it's all the same very proud of myself for moving on, sort of. And here I am reading Moby Dick over and over again, because that's close reading. And I keep coming back to Jefferson, right there in the opening extracts of the book. Quote, "The spermaceti whale found by the Nantucket is an active, fierce animal and requires vast address and boldness in the fisherman." Jefferson issued his report on American whaling in 1788 as the first minister to France. And that report was inseparable from the issues of political economy and natural history that shaped his intellectual and political life. And with it, the politics and broader intellectual currents of the age of revolutions. There's going to be a lot of stretched maritime metaphors here, so we should it has everything to do with race, climate, empire, issues that were ongoing in his world and are very much so in ours. That report and the thinking and politics behind it are probably the most neglected aspects in all the ink spilled on Thomas Jefferson's thought. That's a lot of ink. So I've added to that body of ink again, sorry. But I want to think more broadly and deeply about the history at stake here, both in his time and in ours. So the title of my talk today, as some of you might know, is also the name of a very nice bourbon. I thought it would be good to start there. There's a bourbon, it's called Jefferson's Ocean. Okay. I thought more people would be. The story of this bourbon is that the distillery sponsors an oceanographic research vessel, OSearch. And the distiller, I guess, floats the idea of storing barrels of their regular bourbon on the vessel as it tracks shifting gradients in marine species populations like great white sharks off the Atlantic seaboard. They agree to try, wouldn't you know it, the bourbon picks up this kind of caramel salty character. And the idea is, since a lot of liquor would have been transported in the carrying trade up and down the coast or stored in harbors and dockyards, you're getting a no doubt much more elegant distillation of what would have been a common quality of many spirits in the 19th century. So that's Jefferson's Ocean. That's not the Jefferson's Ocean I want to sell you on today. At least, not exactly. What are marine research vessels like that one finding? Well, they're finding that changes in ocean temperature gradients are doing 2 things: forcing populations up and down the food chain to react, in many cases moving northward into cooler waters. And this, of course, affects fishing, labor, and the economies of coastal communities up and down the Atlantic coast. Sharks and whales, too, react to these changes. And so their movements are important registers, not only of their behavior and even social organization, but of what's happening in the world's oceans. They're starting to worry, too, a great deal that dramatic transformations in oceanic temperatures could destabilize the major current systems of the world's oceans, a kind of spinning corkscrew process, which circulates water in, for example, the northern half of the Atlantic Ocean, driving cold, nutrient-rich water from the depths to be deposited through upwelling into coastal environments, mixing with warming water at the surface, and allowing for marine ecological abundance in places like the Gulf of Maine, coast of Ireland, Scotland, Wales, Cornwall, Monterey Bay, and California. Not only food sources for countless people and others too, but weather patterns rely on these systems. And if they collapse, it's not clear what will happen. It's unlikely it'll be fun. This is from the Washington Post just this summer. In recent years, scientists have warned about the weakening of the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, or AMOC, which transports warm, salty water from the tropics to northern Europe and sends colder water back down south along the ocean floor. This warm, salty water flows northeast from the US coastline toward Europe, creating the current we know as the Gulf Stream. It's precisely that current that's in trouble. Now, some of you might know that the Gulf Stream, that quote, river in the ocean, was first charted by Benjamin Franklin. Even then, you might still be thinking, okay, Matt, that bourbon part was funny, I guess, but what does this have to do with Jefferson or Franklin for that matter? Still less with constitutionalism and democracy. Everything. In his 1786 letter to Jean-Baptiste Leroy, a French physicist and encyclopedist, Jefferson expressed enthusiasm for Spanish visions of cutting a canal through the isthmus connecting North and South American continents. Jefferson guesses, in his usual stunningly matter-of-fact way, that the Gulf Stream would stop flowing and would channel water through the canal instead, creating a kind of maritime commerce conductor to the Pacific, and he says, making the northern Atlantic waters more stagnant and, in his view, safer. Out-of-work fishermen and sailors, he says, would seek more secure employment in the coastal carrying trades or become the good virtue-breasted yeoman farmers like he wanted them to be. And the United States would thus be more self-contained and less entangled in economic ties with the leading commercial and maritime power of the day, which to Jefferson's chagrin was not France, but Britain. He goes on to say that deforestation and some judicious mountain flattening of the Appalachian Range will allow for moderating extreme heat and cold in the continental interior, because it would let what he calls sea breezes in. It's hardly TJ at his worst, as any reader of the notes on the state of Virginia will know, but it's still pretty bad. The breathlessness with which he contemplates climate change, geoengineering, planned ecological degradation, and destroying the livelihoods of people who live in regions he doesn't, all in the service of his very particular understanding of the Republic and its place in the world, is pretty galling. Given how eerily similar Jefferson's cheery dreams for a stagnant North Atlantic are to the nightmare the scientists I mentioned fear we might soon be living in, I want to suggest that those dreams should give us pause. Now you might say, okay, but that's one letter. Anyone who studies Jefferson knows this guy says all sorts of crazy stuff in his letters. They're hardly indicative or determinative of the spirit of his thought. Jefferson had a lot of errant tweets, you might say. But I don't think it's that simple. I think this was a small part of a deep and abiding ambivalence, a lifelong struggle to come to terms with the watery parts of the world and how they fit, if at all, with the expansive settler colonial paradise he wrote about and the actualities of the plantation system in which he lived. After all, his later correspondence with Leroy on rivers and steamships was part and parcel of his thinking about transportation over water in the continental interior, which he viewed as a more promising arena for the future of American maritime history. These issues came to the fore nowhere more concretely than in his engagement with the geopolitical implications of American whaling and his representation of Nantucket whalers before the French Council of State in particular. I wrote a book about Jefferson's thought, about his material practices of study, his theorizing, and I, like just about everyone else, basically skipped over his report on American whaling, written in 1788 to sum up his account of the efforts to reverse a French decision to ban American whale oil. In that report, we find Jefferson not only confronting maritime history, but writing it. Like a lot of Jefferson's texts, it's very bizarre. I'll get to that and how and why, but first I want to observe that while the text itself is very strange, its official presentation as part of his papers published by Princeton University Press is also pretty interesting. In a very lengthy introduction in volume 14 of the regular series, the editors explained that Jefferson would have been hard-pressed to have done the whalers he was supposed to do. He was supposed to be representing any justice, for his philosophical conceptions of law and liberty, they say, had nothing to do with the toil and tenacity of those who make a living in the element of the sea. It's great stuff, downright Melville. There it is right there in the papers of Thomas Jefferson. It's worth speculating, actually, though, about what the editors might have been reading or watching. After all, Henry Ford's film came out in 1956, just 2 years before the publication of the volume. It's interesting to note, too, that whaling in 1958 was hardly a thing of the past, when in fact that was the height of industrial whaling around the world, as it recovered and expanded in the wake of World War II. More whales are estimated to have been taken from the world's oceans in just the late 50s and early 60s than are estimated to have been taken in the entirety of the 19th century. There's something to think about. The damage done by that hunt is still very much with us. So like the ocean, the history we inhabit is layered, and the layers are constantly shifting, grading, changing, literally and allegorically, we might say. John Adams described Jefferson's mind as like a great river, whose depths we can't see or hear. Henry Adams famously wrote of Jefferson that he could only be sketched by the historian touch by touch with a fine pencil, and the perfection of the likeness depended upon the shifting and uncertain flicker of its semi-transparent shadows. In their biography of Jefferson, and Edward and reader Peter Onuf say we shouldn't be convinced of this. Semi-transparent shadows, I don't know, I like that. Their argument is that it lets historians off the hook from trying to understand the history. Maybe that's the case. I I think it also allows historians to put Jefferson to work in thinking about the present. I think that is something historians can and should do. We've always understood Jefferson and Jeffersonian democracy terrestrial. The work of the great Jefferson scholars, past and present, is almost entirely and quite rightfully in a lot of ways focused on Western land, settler colonialism, agrarian political economy. We know that narrative very well. Jefferson spent a lot of time and political and intellectual energy trying to make the Atlantic world work for his vision of republicanism, and it just didn't. He really did have trouble thinking about how to fit the sea, an environment that so consistently resists human efforts to claim to control it, into his understanding of politics and history. There are times when his efforts to do so are pretty funny, but it would be too easy to see the story of Jefferson's confrontation with water as merely a misadventure. We too are confronting a world of dramatic transformation and stark questions about what a changing climate will do to our understandings of territory, sovereignty, belonging, freedom, and history. Our ideas and ideals, to say nothing of our institutions, are under immense pressure. The population and who and what we think of as included in it, and in what ways will have to evolve to meet the demands of the day. Jefferson struggles with these same issues, even if in a different context, can illuminate our own. The ocean was absolutely central to these struggles and problems, just as it is today. Jefferson, it turns out, is perhaps best sketched under a certain kind of pressure from the present, with the lighting and changing, flickering, and finally disappearing to our eyes, the deeper and darker you go. So I want to take a dive through these interrelated layers of history, Jefferson's ocean, political thought, and the Terraqueous globe, a phrase Melville borrowed from the detailed British world map of 1794, reflecting Cook's explorations of the Pacific, which in turn caught Jefferson's attention too. How did Jefferson come to terms, if he managed to do so at all, with the fact that he had to live, think, and act in oceanic history, where the particularities of purportedly stable identities and narratives are brought together in and across histories of empire, where in turn the legal boundaries of sovereignty and of humanity are revealed to be part of an even larger totality? How does history, or law, literature, or maybe through law and literature, take cognizance of that scale and that depth? Historians, I think, make choices, implicit and explicit, about focus and method prior to any research. I put this idea to the test in working on Jefferson by seeing what would happen if I read a text like the Notes on the State of Virginia with water rather than land in mind. And when you do that, it reads very, very differently. Water turns out to be everywhere. And just like we can't understand oceanic history without thinking about coastal and continental history, we can't understand Jefferson's thinking about oceans without first working through his thinking about their tributaries. The rivers, he says, must have been more like an inland ocean, a distant geological past. He got all excited when he found seashells on the mountains of his home. More pragmatically, from the earliest queries in the notes, Jefferson is concerned with trumping up the navigability of Virginia's great rivers like the James and the Potomac. His concern is to connect Virginia to the Atlantic world through water, not to cleave it off. These rivers, he says, are the most powerful agents in nature, and a good thing too. Jefferson was not alone in observing that the world he knew was moving out of what we would later call the Blue Ice Age. The change in our climate, he wrote, is taking place very sensibly. No kidding. Enlightened observations of warming trends were part of broader conjectures in the era that imperial cultivation of the North American continent could bring about a kind of planned moderation of the cold climate of the North, facilitating the better integration and expansion of colonial plantations. As means of transport and sources of water and irrigation, rivers would be an absolutely critical piece of any such plans. You only have to take a refreshed glance at his father Peter Jefferson's map of Virginia, the global maps displayed at Monticello with highlighted riverways, to start to see what I mean. Lurking, as it were, underneath Jefferson's territorial focus is a sustained concern with the watery parts of the world. That was probably true from an early age. The late great historian Bernard Bailyn once asked what it meant for Jefferson, the slave owner and philosopher. He grew up in this far western borderland in Britain, looking out a window from Queen Anne rooms of spare elegance into a wild, uncultivated land. It's an eloquent question, but kind of a misleading one. Space to Jefferson's west might have been something we might call wild and uncultivated in parts, but it was hardly empty or primitive, and it wasn't all just land. Later in life, Jefferson would send a couple of guys by the names of Lewis and Clark out west on rivers, looking for a watery route to the Pacific. That was the goal. Jefferson's slave owning and intellectual life were both products of an Atlantic world. Bodies and books both came over on boats. That was a fact of his life that weighed heavily on his thinking. I might even say that's what most of his thinking was about. Without question, the issue of the security of property and other human beings was a central part of the breakdown of British imperial governance that became the American Revolution. Black resistance, and with that, the idea of Black resistance in white minds were powerful forces in Atlantic politics. Lord Dunmore's proclamation held out the difficult promise of enslaved people finding freedom behind lines of British control out into the oceanic world of British dominion, hardly a funhouse of unmitigated freedom for most of the people living in it. Port cities, coasts, and harbors became high-intensity legal zones as the movements of goods and people through them produced constitutional and jurisdictional conflict over how to govern and police these spaces. It's hardly been understudied in recent years, but the importance of the Caribbean simply can't be overstated. For his entire political career, Jefferson would have to carefully negotiate his desire for closer connections with plantation economies in the French and British Caribbean, with his innate driving fear of the size and revolutionary potential of the free and enslaved Black populations in those economies, and what he called the chances of vindictive and predatory descents on the coasts of the United States. As the historian Gray Brandon has shown, Black resistance to a world of brutal force confronted white politics and literature with the very empire of force and necessity that such massively oppressive regimes of power had to hold at bay. Think about the events on the border just these past few weeks. Desperation driving refugees, and the violence they were met with. That context is absolutely critical for understanding Jefferson's ambivalence about maritime realities. The world's oceans were a medium for transporting commerce and empire, to be sure. It could also be the means for those on the receiving end of that empire to revolt, escape, wrench their freedom out of a captive environment, even, he feared, to push the flow of power in the other direction. Like most contagions, Jefferson was very much aware that the contagion of liberty usually spreads faster in a maritime setting. Jefferson was deeply afraid of the Black Atlantic. He wasn't really all that much of a fan of the white Atlantic. It's one of the great paradoxes of the politics of the Revolution that on more than one occasion, Jefferson the Virginian found himself being the appointed spokesman for the interests of New England sailors, fishers, and whalers, all from a fight that starts in the Harbor District of Boston. The Declaration of Independence, of course, indicts the Crown for many things. This is one of the more crucial ones. He has plundered our seas, ravaged our coasts, burnt our towns, and destroyed the lives of our people. Plundered our seas and ravaged our coasts. Another biggie, he has constrained our fellow citizens taken captive on the high seas to bear arms against their country. Captive on the high seas, oppressment. The labor politics of the maritime world is one of the major factors putting pressure on opposition leaders to act, as social historians of the maritime world have long pointed out. Note that there's an environmental aspect to the indictment as well. There's something else going on here too. Being subject to force and arbitrary will, to discretion, was simply not something a free white man in Jefferson's vision of British America was supposed to encounter in his life. Jefferson wasn't just ambivalent about saltwater. He was ambivalent about the kinds of work that prevailed on and in that environment, and about the implications of those kinds of work for politics, foreign and domestic. It was pretty clear to him that oceanic geopolitics was a realm that quickly escaped any attempt at making it governable. The states plunged into wars over navigation routes and fishing grounds, where the tail of imperial periphery, borderlands, and open seas could easily wag the dog of intentional and enlightened political and diplomatic discussion. Again, a world perhaps not so different from our own. The skepticism of the maritime world is one where philosophical statesmen would be following and reacting to developments out of their control would only prove to be more the case when, in his view, the greedy overreach of Nantucket whalers threatened to disrupt his pet project of an Atlantic and Franco-American trade alliance to complement the military alliance for the American Revolution, an alliance that, in his view, was a binding pact between two nations, not just two governments. His report on whaling is dripping with skepticism and something almost like contempt, balanced with a kind of grudging admiration for the whalers. Representing their interests was a primary part of his job as minister. They didn't fit into his wider vision of the primacy of the Southern and Western agrarian planter vision. The Nantucket whale fishery, which Edmund Burke said was one of the great marine resources of the empire, had seen its business heavily disrupted by the war with Britain, its primary market. French officials had offered to have the ships operate out of France, Dunkirk actually, but just a few years later, the same French officials were growing impatient and suspicious. On longer voyages into deeper waters after more valuable whales, the whalers had begun developing the ability to process whale oil at sea and were thereby able to pick their markets, fetching higher prices. In the fall of 1788, betting on its ability to sponsor its own whaling industry, the French Council of State issued an order that banned foreign whale oil. Jefferson eventually secured an American exception. His observations on the whale fishery revealed as many tensions as the document resolved. It was clear to the whalers that Jefferson was at best an imperfect ally in the defense of their interests and industry. Whaling, Jefferson observed, was just about the poorest industry a young man could find himself working in. He rightly observed that by and large, the practice of paying everyone in parts of the ship's profits, subtracting costs for boarding the sailor on the ship no less, was basically wage theft. Like his and Madison's opposition to Hamilton's plan to pay Revolutionary War bonds at face value to current holders, Jefferson had a planter's disgust for wage labor. He wasn't wrong in either case about what he was looking at: capitalist labor relations and financial speculation, and the service of the state in supporting and expanding their development. He didn't much like the owners of these businesses, either, from bankers to whalers. Jefferson had an early and persistent fear of men with the economic clout to thwart the sovereignty of law and the problems their ascendancy posed to the Republic, or his vision of it anyway. In their perceived disregard for national boundaries and interests, the whalers, in Jefferson's view, were an indication of the corrupting influence of profit and its capacity to supplant citizenship as the primary locus of one's relationship with others. Whalers, trading with Britain and anywhere else they saw fit, were not only complicating Jefferson's hopes for a Franco-American commercial pact that could rival British dominance in the Atlantic, they were revealing themselves to have no loyalty to the young republic, at least not enough to be counted on. Jefferson's more political, nationalist understanding of commerce ran into the emergent world of fluid capital and labor. Jefferson possessed these anxieties partly out of principle, yes, and partly out of his own fears about the threats these developments posed to his vision for the republic and his way of life as an indebted slave owner. You just can't separate even his dealing with whalers, or whales for that matter, with his thinking about race. Indeed, it wasn't just whalers, but whales themselves that Jefferson felt the need to think out loud about in his report. Jefferson hints at the issue of the sustainability of whales. Populations of blackfish or pilot whales were fading. Greenland or bowhead whales required venturing into dangerous Arctic waters. The Atlantic gray whale was already extinct. North Atlantic right whales were already scarce, and today the population is on the brink of extinction. Sperm whales, Jefferson noted, demanded longer, more dangerous voyages that asked everything and more from the men who hunted. Jefferson recounts the history of the whaling industry in terms of its natural and civil history, one of which is to suggest that whaling should be folded within the broader picture of a Franco-American trading relationship. And secondly, that the United States would do well to lessen its focus on Atlantic commerce, as he would later suggest in his capacity as Secretary of State, to work more deliberately on economic ties with the plantation societies of the Caribbean. The events that presaged the Haitian Revolution would change that view pretty quickly for Jefferson. As president, Jefferson would oversee the embargo of Saint Domingue and Britain. The movements and histories of people were all the more vexing for him, alongside the movements and histories of currents, whales. In the extensive history that he recounts in his 1788 report, Jefferson ignores the role that Wampanoag people of Nantucket and the surrounding area played in exposing early Quaker settlers to shore whaling off the skating banks around the island. I raise that point to suggest that the entanglements of human histories of violence, racial supremacy, and empire, with questions of the boundaries of political humanity, the very idea of a human being, are inextricable. That Jefferson can think about whales as something like participants in modern history, but has trouble, to say the least, with indigenous or Black people making history for themselves all around him, should again give us pause. More than anything, it speaks to what the anthropologist Ann Stoler has called the duration of empire and some of its modes of thinking in our purportedly post-colonial world. Jefferson's sense of history and politics, of sovereignty, of a people's ability, in historian J.J. Pocock's words, to make and manage their own history, raises all sorts of questions about who belongs to that people, who manages that history, and whether history, natural and civil, then or now, is really susceptible to such management. After all, who was doing a good job managing political, constitutional, and environmental history today? Not us. Jefferson hoped he could, but the forces of global commerce and valuable resources, commodities, properties, and the lives of other human beings, while certainly in part products of efforts to control and manage the course of human events, contained contradictions that were already unraveling in the world around him. Jefferson felt the dialectical movement of history slip his attempts to possess and control it, to turn oceans into rivers and canals, to borrow from T.S. Eliot. In short, he was afraid. I don't think it's fully possible to understand Jefferson without this sense of existential dread in some of his writing, and his keen awareness of his own finitude and that of the projects, big and small, that he embarked on in his life. I think that makes him very relevant indeed to the present. Well, you might be saying, there you go. You're asking us to think about all this stuff, these global trans-historical dimensions, but really we're just talking about Thomas Jefferson here still, right? And if that's right, then why? Yeah, basically that is right. It would have been so much better, wouldn't it, to write about Jefferson's weather notes or climatological observations, the apparatus Jefferson invented to collect rainwater in poplar forests, or about enslaved people carrying water up the hill to Monticello, or about his own voyage across the Atlantic, or about the prehistoric scallop named after him. Maybe. I want to make an argument here in closing for reincorporating the history and historiography of political thought into how we think about American history, and about early American studies in particular. Why privilege Jefferson's perspective as I have here? Because his texts lend themselves to what I hope is a kind of an immersive and maybe even subversive reading. And that's a good thing to do anyway. But more importantly, it allows us to go deeper into some questions and issues in the materials of history, and to supplement, without opposing per se, the current tendency to spread out our space of inquiry across ever more vast territory, potentially thinning it out as we go. Under, over, and around vast early America, there is a blue early America, a deep early America. And a lot of my current work is trying to think about how to access it, how to bring it into the writing of history, whether that's really possible or a wise thing to do. Historians and legal scholars like Helen Roswadowski, Christopher Tomlins, Marissa Milani, David Armitage, among others, have asked how to incorporate the depths and the life we find there into history, not just the human traversing of the surface into oceanic histories. How do you get at something else besides just the ships and going from port to port? Is an oceanic history more than that? I'll come back to that point in just a little bit in conclusion. I'll say here, I don't think it's really possible without literature, without something like political or critical theory, and without thinking historically, critically, about the nature of historical representation, about narrative, about the terms on and through which we posit and use well terms like history, sovereignty, identity, modern, culture, how we tell ourselves, wrongly it might be. The empirical and the speculative can be so easily separated. Drawn the entire historical world I've tried to paint for you today out of one sentence in the opening pages of the novel you all should have read by now. I had someone, that's a joke. I had someone I was on a panel with recently say, after reading the paper, Jefferson's Whale, that they had a sense of how instead of asking how Melville read Jefferson, I was grappling with something like how Jefferson would read Melville. I liked that. Another way to put that might be, what is Melville doing with Jefferson? What is he showing us? I think he's showing us something not altogether different from what Henry Adams was trying to get us to appreciate. That the context in which a text or figure makes sense changes in the flickering, fading light of the present, under pressure from the weight of the oceanic history varying down and on us. Now you might be thinking, well, okay, it's nothing short of banality to say, oh, you see, history is political. The sense that histories we write are always shaped by our present. Of course they are. Your objectivity is impossible, but so the argument to go, that isn't and shouldn't stop historians from trying. I don't necessarily agree even with that, but I want to suggest, for lack of a better word, that there can be a deeper connection between history and politics. Politics is inseparable from problems of temporality and duration, of how long a situation or policy or even a polity lasts, and what happens after, of who is responsible and what kind of legitimacy, if any, underwrites that power, where it comes from. It's very difficult to imagine political life without a sense of the relation between the past and the present, in the conjecture of what the future will bring, of the life of lasting political projects, if any, in the present. The study of history, for most of its history, in the West at least, has largely been about preparation for political life in this sense. History, the representation of the past and the present, gives shape to legal and political imagination, just as law and polity give shape to what we say about history. The history of what, of whom, when, where. What is a history in this sense, if not that of politics, of collectivities and their origins, their efforts, their potential fracturing and decay? In his extensive study of Edward Gibbon's work of history, The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, J.J. Pocock suggests that Gibbon, writing in the Age of Revolutions, had come to wonder, given the transformations of his present, whether it was possible to write history anymore at all. Whether it was possible to write history anymore at all, to tell a story about some kind of political continuity when there didn't seem to be much stable legal and political continuity to write about or in. This is a big part of the era's historical consciousness. There's a reason the halls of Monticello were decorated with ruins. The Marxist dictum of the following century would express a similar awareness and critique of contemporary history. All that is solid melts into air. So how and where do we have politics when it's not clear there's a shared sense of reality, much less polity, where political life would happen? How do you write history, broadly conceived, in the face of constant flux and seemingly endlessly multiplying perspectives, narratives, and memories? History's all. This is basically, as I see it, if not what the 1619 Project is about itself, and what the rather woeful debate about it among historians is about. Absolutely. No one's debating a ship's manifest from 1619 or the legality of the Somerset decision, or the exact intentions and reactions of Lord Dunmore's proclamation. The debate, rather, if there can be said to be one at all, is about the political implications of saying white supremacy and anti-Black racism is, quote, baked into the DNA of the nation. Whether the idea of a singular nation even remains an accurate category at that point is one of the issues left relatively unexplored in the project, as many scholars of Native American history and empire and colonialism have pointed out. I find the project very useful, provocative, creative, and imperfect as any account would be, whoever might write it. I have to confess I've been confused in many cases by the reaction of other scholars in the field. But beneath the surface level debates about evidence for this or that claim, what I think fires that reaction is the conviction that if the argument put forward by Nicole Hannah-Jones and her collaborators is taken to be right, then the structuring narrative force of American history, and with it American politics, can be felt to crumble and decay. I don't think they're right necessarily, but I don't think they're wrong to put that concern front and center. Or at least I find it usefully provocative that they have, whether they listen to or not. We all feel it. For them, it's the 1619 Project, which is an odd choice maybe, but all the same, look around. The election of 2020 on January 6th, the creeping spread of the language of civil war amidst racial retrenchment and institutional rot, inaction on climate change, public health, and the persistence of the pandemic, disinvestment from public education and the uncertain fate of humanistic study in the traditional setting of institutions of higher learning, precisely the kind of learning that's supposed to prepare people to take hold of themselves and their history, or at least try to meet the challenges of their present together. It's decay. It's crumbling. It's the fear that what we have taken to be solid will not remain so, and the awareness that perhaps it never was. And it's scary. Anybody see the movie The Green Knight? Came out recently. This is what that movie is about. You should watch it. This is what Jefferson saw in the idea of the slave revolt and the motley crews of the globalizing, ungovernable maritime world. The precise reversal of his sense of the history he was shaping, his enlightened conjecture and steering of the ship of state. The historian and theorist Reinhard Koselleck observed that after the French Revolution, it became the default assumption of social theory that the natural progression of humanity was towards the modern republic. And everything from ethics to the supposed qualities of races and civilizations was evaluated according to this progression scientifically. This philosophy of history made any possible threat to the ordered progression of republican politics almost unthinkable and terrifying. And as a result, modern history, he writes, gets experienced as a series of cascading crises, real and imagined. Individuals in this case feel more and more the weight of responsibility for doing something, anything to fix what's wrong with the city, the state, the country, the world, nature, in the face of forces that are beyond any individual's direction. The constant feeling of crisis and emergency deadens us to actual needs and demands, and it can be debilitating individually and collectively. As Hannah Arendt appreciated, political thought of the American Revolution held on to just enough of that older sense of history, not as a science of development, but as preparation for politics, to feel the sense of uncertainty, and in some cases at least, to live and act in the face of it. Why study the political thought of the founders and mull over well and widely read books? Because they were right about certain timeless truths? No. Because they offer us wisdom? That has not been my experience. Critical reflection on the ideas and institutions of the founding enlivens us to our enmeshments in political history, and to how our thinking and acting in the present is mediated by the history of thinking and acting, of confronting questions of collective fate and responsibility. In his lectures at Dartmouth in 2017, philosopher Cornel West asked if there was a historian somewhere getting ready to become the hero of their time, to write the narrative of decline and fall in the present. He then said, well, we already have that maybe. And his name was Herman Melville. And that's what Moby Dick is about. That same summer, I gave a talk about Melville's reading of Gibbon to much less fanfare and in front of way fewer people. And it became my first real publication on Melville. So I was pretty excited when watching these lectures recently. I think he's right. Cruelty, injustice, violence, race, God, gods, empire, the global hunt, oceans, labor, capital, ownership, nature, nationalism, blood, sweat, and tears. And in that, love, desire, comradeship, hope, and fear. All in a story that is at least in part about the inexplicable inability of a group of people to avoid calamity when the end of this story is staring them right in the face for 135 chapters and change. Gibbon was one source of Melville's, and Jefferson was another. When the whale himself finally arrives on the scene, he's described as Virginia's natural bridge, rising like a great marble arch out of the sea. In his novel, Marty, and if you think Moby Dick is a slog, you have no idea. The travelers encounter an island tribe of settlers and the enslaved people who work under them. As they enter the territory, they encounter an arch where they find inscribed the motto, "In this Republican land, all men are born free and equal." Now, usually allegory is somewhat oblique and the reference is open to many possible interpretations. Here it's pretty simple. There is Jefferson and the politics of the American Revolution and founding being taken for a ride again. Much of the philosophical discourse and inquiry among the visitors that follows in the novel contemplates the question of when, not if, history will turn, and when it does, whether it can happen peacefully. The whole episode is a reflection on duration, on the space where politics and history meet, and specifically on Jefferson's extended consideration of what slavery is doing in the Republic in the United States of Virginia, which he had just published as he sat down to write his observations on the whale fishery. Jefferson looked out onto an Atlantic world of profound transformation and flux. His thinking about politics, part of it inherited, part of it developed in his own highly particular way, ran into real trouble in that confrontation. We're not Jefferson, but we too are confronting a world of changing natural and civil history, where our inherited assumptions about constitutionalism working, democracy as a shared project, the importance of history, and the boundaries between nations, territories, and seas, between nature and history, are all crumbling in the face of present challenges. I want to try and think about the history of confronting the course of events, human and otherwise, of becoming alert to these deeper realities. How does one write history, interpret law, or think and act politically in this confrontation? What past can we bring into the present that might help us meet the demands of the day? There seems to be a consensus growing among many thinkers that these questions demand abandoning the ruined humanistic legacies of the past thought and politics. Of the past thought and politics. I don't know. I think we need to dive more deeply into that legacy, albeit critically and carefully, but creatively too. In whatever form or context we go on to ask these kinds of questions, we will need all the resources of the humanities, and especially literature, to even think about answering them. Thank you very much.
Okay. Yes, so let's have some questions and answers, and apologize if the people that started bringing stuff out into the lobby out there. So I was not running out through the and people who are watching online, if you submit questions there, we'll try to get to them, though that may be a little difficult under today's circumstances, but hopefully we can. I actually want to start, Matt. So you mentioned tantalizingly, how Jefferson, this idea of like what Jefferson would think about Melville. So what would Jefferson think about Melville? And
well, yeah. So I mean,
and I guess considering that Melville actually clearly was a Democrat, right? And brought it up a lot. I mean, I actually learned from your various. I looked at a bunch of your Melville writings. It's constantly coming up. So in that, even though seems kind of unlikely, and given especially even the way you're just presenting Melville, it seems like triply unlikely. What if anything would they see in each other?
That's an interesting question.
I mean, literally. I mean, in a literal way, right? At the time, not in a.
Well, I mean, yeah. I mean, part of the provocation of the question, right, is that by the time Melville's heading out, Jefferson's dead, right? And so it's just sort of untimely to even think about what their relationship.
Well, but it isn't because he's on everyone's lips. And
yes, that's right. No, that's right. So I think because of that, there's a calibration to the debate I think is really interesting. What I would say is, I would answer that question by kind of going back to my sort of unique take on Jefferson, which is that he's way more attuned to what's being lost in the age of emotions than we usually give him credit for. He's thinking about what's happening to the authority of law in the world that he's in. And he's thinking really carefully about how you have written constitutions and the authority of written law and the stability of interpreted authority when anyone can interpret anything they want all the time. Where do they do that? Who gets to do that? And why? He's got real questions that come out of his engagement in almost kind of late medieval English legal thought. And I think he's attuned to what's missing and what's disappearing, and he's trying to think about how to replace that. And my argument about Melville is something very similar. So that he's sort of looking at, okay, if you get rid of the royal prerogative, if you get rid of these forms of authority that promise justice, who promises justice in a democracy, in a market society, in this kind of liberal order that we've developed for ourselves? Where does the power to do justice sit? How do you wrestle with that question? And is it legitimate in a democracy? And what does that say about a democracy, if not? And so I think what I would want to say Jefferson sees in Melville would be a realization that you need the early modern world to think about the modern world.
Okay, I think I get it. We'll talk. We'll have time to talk. Let's go to people questions people have in the room. Go ahead. You're on TV, and so we can just swing the camera. What are we? Are you? Why don't you stand up and say your name?
Okay. Hi, I'm Erin Holmes. I'm one of the postdocs here at the Kinder Institute. I want to thank you for that really wonderful talk. And I'm curious what you think Jefferson's authorization of an involvement in the Coastal Survey about 20 years later tells us about his kind of evolution in thinking about political engagement with the Terraqueous globe following the Haitian Revolution, the Quasi-War, and all of these other kind of disruptive events of the early 19th century.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Thank you. I wrestle with that a lot, actually, because I think anytime you see Jefferson engaging with, I think, oceans or coasts, I think he's doing it grudgingly. Sort of like, I thought I would solve this problem and I haven't, damn it. And I think that's another example of that. He writes earlier that if we don't find a way to agree on what free trade means, then he uses this phrase, we're going to shackle each other in our ports. Our ports will all be shackled by protectionist policies. And what does that mean? Well, because the world doesn't work according to the rules that he sees it as working, he starts shackling ports too. It's what the British embargo and the Haitian embargo are about. And so for him, you need to have kind of has to go back to a kind of an early modern idea of the state as something that isn't just letting stuff happen on the periphery or on its coast, but that knows what's going on. What price is cod fetching in these different markets? Because revolutions happen over things like this, right? I mean, we can lose control of the political situation by these things that are happening in these spaces that our traditional understanding of law and politics doesn't kind of think about or doesn't really pay that much attention to. So I think for him, even something like that is an extension of this dilemma that he's wrestling with. I would love to be able to just say, well, the coasts are the coasts, they're taking care of themselves. Ports are ports, they're taking care of themselves. Navigational routes are taking care of themselves. But he can't. He can't do that because he's caught in this dilemma about, on the one hand, he wants an understanding of free trade and kind of not a laissez-faire, but free trade, right? Having a sense of kind of commerce flowing across national boundaries. But that means it's not going to work according to his very nationalist understanding of what needs to happen and what doesn't need to happen and what commerce should be doing and who it should be doing it for. So he has to step in and intervene. That's kind of the repeated sort of theme of his thought, I think, is that he wants to let something go. And they kind of, oh no, wait, that's not what I meant. Or now we have to get involved. Now we have to intervene. And that's kind of like the story of him and water, I think, is that on the one hand, it fits into this Jeffersonian rhetoric about a world becoming more modern, interconnected, and all this kind of stuff. But guess what? Interconnection means free black sailors are going to be coming into Charleston and Baltimore and Boston. He doesn't like that. He doesn't like that one bit. So he's got to have law and authority there to solve that problem for him. And so there's just a tension in his thought that never gets really, never gets resolved. It's just sort of something about his thinking and the tensions in the world that he sees.
Okay, who else? Go. No, students. Undergrad or undergrad? I can't tell who anyone is actually.
My name's Luke Gannon. I'm just a freshman undergrad.
Very good.
You said something about oceanic history or oceanic politics being about ports more than ports and ships. What did you mean by that? What more is there than ship logs and port logs?
That's a really good question. Thank you. So I guess I'm trying to figure that out. But it's an interesting question to think about, right? Like maritime history is one of the oldest traditions of history writing, right? It's not new. But I guess the question would be, what's the relationship between something like maritime history and oceanic history? So how do you write the history that would go down in the water column and not just across the sea? Well, you said, okay, well, we have numbers from whaling ships, just like we have numbers from slave ships that can give us data on tonnage, on the amount of stuff that's being transported, right? You can have a real cold calculating statistical history of that. But that doesn't seem like it's enough in either case. So how do you get at that? And I think if you sort of transport something like the slave trade, yeah, you can have numbers and economic data points and market, what happens in slave markets in places like Baltimore and New Orleans. But something like Turner's painting of the slave ship gets you something about that reality that the statistics don't. And so part of my argument would be you need art and aesthetics and literature to even think about how to write the history of things and environments and lives that escape the traditional categories we have for writing history. That would be my kind of gut feeling. Thank you.
My name is Lawrence Lonnie. I'm a PhD candidate here. My question, I really like your talk, by the way. I just wanted to say that. But my question is sort of, you focus a lot on Jefferson, and I guess in some sense this might be a little bit unfair, but is he the only one thinking about the ocean, at this time? And I was kind of wondering if you can kind of maybe put some of that into context a little bit. Like, is Jefferson's thought about the terraqueous globe unique, or is he sort of, part of a larger sort of tradition, in the 1790s or whenever?
So he's certainly not the only one thinking about it. Yeah.
Every Secretary of State.
I mean,
Must have had the right.
the Federalist Papers have to deal with what are we going to do with Admiralty? Where do it's one of the things that bothered them the most about the British Constitution, is you had this form of discretionary authority that just had enormous power. But how do you have a nation state without that kind of court, without that kind of authority, right? And so there's a lot of people wrestling with the confrontation between jurisdiction and oceanic space. And that history is very long. I mean, it goes back at least to the Justinianic Code and wrestling with the Mediterranean as a legal space. And there's times in Melville's work where he just stops and thinks about this. I mean, there's parts of White Jacket, for example, that are just readings of Justinian and Roman law on the sea. And it's just kind of like, okay, Melville, here we go, So that is a big question, and it's alive in something like Cook's explorations and British and American and French conquest of the Pacific. And it's alive in questions like, who's in charge of making sure that Charleston works? Who's in charge of making sure that, we know who's coming into the country, right? What kind of authority can that be? Who's in charge of protecting sailors that might be impressed? Can you go get them? Or are they just gone, right? I mean, like, what do you do with that? And I don't, there's a lot of people wrestling with that. I think Jefferson is useful. Just like there's lots of people thinking about race. Oh, there's lots of people thinking about race. But Jefferson, almost out of a sense of naivete almost, has to theorize it. He has to kind of think about it. There's almost kind of there's something useful about it, because he's like, okay, well, if we're going to have slavery in a republic, I better sit down and think about why. So you get the Notes on the State of Virginia, which is this, kind of stomach churning read in many ways. But it's important to pay attention to, because Jefferson realizes that if you're gonna have a language of natural rights and racial supremacy, you're gonna have to think about what those two things are doing in the same political space and in the same legal space. And I think the same thing is true for his relationship with oceanic history. He's not the only one thinking about it, but his mind works in such a way that he's like, okay, I gotta think about this. I gotta wrestle with this. So the goal of his observations on the whale fishery, I mean, that could have been a paragraph. It could have been just a paragraph saying, this is what I did. This is the goal of American diplomacy with regards to whaling, bada bing, bada boom. It's a chunk of volume 14 of the papers of Thomas Jefferson. It's a long document that goes into Basque whalers and Cape Cod and all this kind of but he doesn't need to do that. But in his he has the kind of brain that is useful for the historian, because he goes and says, okay, if I'm going to think about whaling and politics and law, I've got to really go back and study this. And so the reason I think Jefferson is worth paying attention to on this front is because he's so explicit about so many of the issues that are at stake. And I think that's one of the reasons Melville finds it useful, is because, and it's part of my shtick, is that the Notes on the State of Virginia pops up across a lot of Melville's work. And one of the reasons it does is because if you're trying to look for racial ideology in American thought, or anxieties about empire in American thought, Jefferson's really useful. And I think that remains the case today.
There's probably not only the parts that we worry about now.
What do you mean, sir?
Well, sorry. It's probably not only the parts of Notes of Virginia. Now there's 5-6 pages.
Yeah.
That people are overwhelmingly focused on now.
Right.
Whereas I imagine Melville probably read it more widely.
No, that's true. And I think this is part of my thinking about rivers and lakes and how they fit into what America is, the maritime boundary. But I live next to it now. The maritime boundary that separates the United States from Canada for most of the border, right? Is you just don't think of it that way, but that's what it is. And it's a gulf that opens out onto the Gulf of Maine, right? I mean, it's a really important space, and it's a very fraught space, and it is from the very beginning. And so things like that people skip over in the notes of the State of Virginia, like the collections of state papers and all that kind of stuff. What are those state papers? They're Richard Hakluyt's observations on global exploration and British Empire in the early modern world. They're things that document Virginia's place in the British dominions around this kind of oceanic world that they've opened themselves up to. So again, if you just read that text, which is always thought of as this kind of agrarian, romantic text, if you just say water to yourself and then start reading it again, it's completely different. It starts out by talking about rivers, then it talks about mountains and waterfalls, and then it talks about trade, and then it talks about ports. And it just opens out a complete, it's the same text, but it reads very differently if you start with water in mind. Part of my argument would be we can read things that way and discover a whole new historical environment in doing so.
Who else? Jay?
I'm Jay Sexton. Now you got me wanting to read Moby Dick and with land in mind. But gosh, just so much there, so much range over all this stuff. I guess my question is about, I mean, you're focusing here on whaling, obviously, and the kind of commercial and theoretical side of the maritime world. Of course, a lot of people would look at this period through the prism of naval competition, and especially given that a lot of these commercial vessels are convertible into warships in times of war, and that some of those hierarchies that you talk about are just a feature of naval systems in the Atlantic context, and it's the kind of naval competitive side of the story, which is also revolutionizing the growth of political power terrestrial, on land. So I guess I'm just wondering, how does that fit into this story at all, or is the Navy thing a separate thing for you?
No, I mean, I think it is separate for me in this sense, because I'm kind of taking Jefferson's lead here and sort of seeing what he's paying attention to. But to get back to the question about the coastal survey, Jefferson doesn't want to think about a world of naval power because he doesn't like the political economy of naval power. He doesn't like the deficit spending it takes to keep an army and a navy going to do that. He thinks you can have an empire and have global economic reach without those things. And what he finds out when he's dealing with, say, the Barbary states is that ain't so. If you're going to go throwing your elbows around and you want to trade in the ports of the world, with commerce is going to come forth. And he thinks commerce is something that will mitigate force and make it go away. And what he's finding is that's not true. And I think that's the world that Melville's writing about too, which is that we thought that commerce created this world of mutuality. And it gets rid of arbitrary power. It replaces discretion with contract, right? And certainty of that. And in reality, that kind of power is all around. The powers that captains have over sailors, the powers that judges have over captains, the power that courts of admiralty have over all those things is very real. And it's actually intensifying in the late 18th and early 19th century. It's not just sort of sticking around, it's becoming more intense. And I think Jefferson, one of the reasons he really doesn't like the maritime world is because it's a space where discretionary forms of authority are kind of endemic almost to the space. And he just doesn't think that his white farmer boys should be subject to that thing. He really thinks that that's not what a republic should be. And citizens of a republic should be subject to that kind of authority. And I don't think Melville thinks they should be. But Melville's exploring a world where Jefferson's thought didn't do its job. It didn't get rid of those forms of authority. And race and empire are a big part of the reason why.
Melville surely doesn't vindicate that, though. Isn't Melville partly just
I don't think he vindicates
partly
it.
just a Jeffersonian at sea, looking around? At
I don't know. So this is why
looking around at all the ways in which discretionary power.
I don't think so. I don't think he likes it. But I think he's asking a question that would go something like, what do you do with that form of authority? You don't just pretend that it goes away. Someone like Richard Henry Dana is a lot like this. You expect Dana 2 years before the past to say, oh, captains are evil. Just look at this. Oh my God, they're abusive. And he has this sort of story where he recounts a captain beating a sailor mercilessly. And after that, he stops and says, people are going to read this and think captains shouldn't have authority at all, or that captains are naturally unjust. And then he says, but that's not the case. I wouldn't be in favor of any laws regulating the authority of captains because you need that kind of authority. He's not in favor of whippings. What he's saying is the problem here isn't the law. The problem is that the captain's an asshole. That's the problem. And you're not going to fix that with the law. You just need to cultivate better people. But that kind of power and the discretion over how to use it is absolutely necessary to that space, to what a ship is. And so I think
So he's just apologizing for having written a book that made all kinds of people think
yeah,
the opposite.
yeah, maybe that too.
He's
Yeah,
like saying,
but-
no, don't mutiny because I wrote this book.
yeah, that's.
So
But I mean, I
we're
think he
we're
takes
talking
that
about your other paper.
okay, yeah,
you know,
Yeah,
that
I
movie
would just
here.
say I think Melville is trying to take discretionary authority seriously. He's not just trying to say, oh, that's silly, right? He wants the idea that a judge or a captain can protect people, that can forgive debts or exercise mercy in meting out punishment. He takes that form of discretionary authority much more seriously. I don't think he's just dismissing it or critiquing it. I think he actually, it's not like he's not like a secret monarchist and he wants to go back to the early monarchy. He's thinking about the problem. The power to do justice sits in a world of contract, commerce, and republican politics.
Justin?
Hey Matt, Justin Dyer. This is going to take you away from your paper a little bit, but as you're talking about discretion, I was thinking about Billy Budd and whether the theme of that is the same or if it's saying something different about discretion. It seemed like the problem was that the captain didn't have discretion in meting out the punishment.
So I think yeah, this is the last chapter of the Melville book that I haven't written yet, but I think about it and I go to sleep thinking about it and wake up thinking about it. Because yeah, that's the space where Melville thinks about discretionary authority the most. And Captain Vere in that story stops and thinks, well, who do I owe loyalty to? When he has this thing, I'm forgetting the exact language now, he says, what buttons do I wear? Are they the buttons of nature or are they the buttons of the king? They're the buttons of the king. And so it's the king that I owe my loyalty to. And what I would say that passage is reflective of is a tragedy where he doesn't recognize that actually he's wearing the buttons of nature too. That because he has that kind of discretionary authority, he has the authority to say it wouldn't be right for us to hang Billy for doing this. It wouldn't be right. Whether it's the law gives me that power or not is a different question. It wouldn't be right. And so it's not a defense necessarily or just a mere apologia for that kind of discretionary authority, but it's trying to get us to think very carefully about, do you really want that power to go away? And what would it mean if it did? And the answer is it would probably show up again in a face or a form where we didn't expect it. So I think it's that even Billy Budd is about discretion in precisely that sense. It's not a question of getting rid of it. It's a question of using it. Who do we want to have that authority? How are they going to use it?
Very good. So yeah, Rosie.
Hi, I'm Rosie. I'm
Then-
an MA student. I'm going to take this in a slightly different direction. I guess I'll kind of touched on it very briefly, but how like water and moisture and rain, it's all quite important to like Jefferson's era conception of health, health and disease in particular. So I guess kind of how would you take this idea of like political thought, because health and disease is so important to identity, expansion, and control. How would you kind of extrapolate this talk in kind of that direction?
In the direction of health?
Yes.
Oh, let's see. I mean, that's a really interesting question. Really early on in the pandemic, a legal scholar named Thomas Jefferson, who teaches at the London School of Economics, I think, wrote an essay in the London Review of Books where he kind of played with the idea of, you know, where's Hobbes now, basically. And the argument there was that, you know, you were watching the state flail in its most basic attempts, its most basic thing. And if you look very, very carefully on the front page of Leviathan, that famous frontispiece where you've got the artificial man standing there on the coast overlooking the city, there's 2 pandemic doctors going into a house and they've got masks on as they enter. And part of what the symbolism is going there is one of the things the state is supposed to do is protect its people. And a lot of democratic theory over the last couple of decades and critical studies in international law have quite rightly said, oh, but this power to protect, this claim that the United States is protecting people in Afghanistan or Iraq is clearly not the case. So this power is highly suspect. It's a mere rhetorical guise of empire. That's almost certainly the case. But I would have rather had a state that worked when this happened. And so I think part of what I would want to kind of think about is we want the state to do things for us. We want some kind of protection. I mean, you know, that's not a silly thing to ask. You know, what Hobbes is saying is bad things aren't going to happen to you on my watch if you give me this authority. You think about campus space and all the debates we've had about sexual assault and all that. These are the issues on campus.
And Thomas Jefferson.
And Thomas Jefferson. But I mean, I think like what you're promising there is a really strong claim. Not on my watch. Not on my watch. You're going to be safe on my watch. And I'm not saying we just need to go find some form of authority to protect us. I'm saying we've forgotten that challenge at great cost to ourselves. And so I would hope the project gets the left, basically, that's one of my kind of primary, to think about state power and discretionary authority in a slightly more positive or at least open-ended direction than just merely problematizing it or always finding it oppressive or always finding it arbitrary. No, like you want that form of authority. And if you get rid of if you get rid of it, it's going to show up again, whether you like it or not, in some other form from somewhere else. So how do we constitute that authority in our polity? That's the kind of the question we want the project to speak.
Learning to appreciate arbitrary power.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Tara.
Hi, I'm Tara Gunat. I'm a postdoc here. And this isn't a question, it's just a suggestion for somewhere that if you haven't looked at it, it might be interesting. When I'm listening to your talk, it kept reminding me, you might already know about this, of a short essay by Engels called On Authority. And she's arguing, you know this one? Okay. Yeah, and he's arguing against anarchists, and he's saying that there's like authority implicit in certain modes of production or workplaces like ships. And it just kept making me think
Right,
of
so-
him in that piece.
Yeah, I think that's really right. That's a really productive strand of Marxist thought,
Yeah,
which is that anarchism doesn't get you anywhere. In fact, it's basically reactionary, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's kind of like libertarianism.
Yeah.
It tells itself it's not. So I think that stuff is really interesting. Yeah, and Lenin has a very similar kind of contempt for the anarchists as people that aren't. They're not ready to do what we need to do. Yeah.
That's not a big shot. Julia. Okay, sure.
Hi, I'm Julia Gilman. I'm in the MA program. I study Indigenous history of Louisiana Territory and then early Missouri. And I was wondering how if this even exists, the Terraqueousness, which I think is not really a word, but we're going to go with it, of the territory impacted policy or even the approach to settlement.
I think it absolutely did very much. Just to give you a sense of the word comes from a map, a British map in 1794. And they used this word to kind of frame this idea that the British Empire is now a world that is continental and oceanic. And so they kind of come up with this phrase and then it gets picked up and used. But yeah, it's a neologism. Waterways in the continental interior are a huge part of the way that empires are thinking about what that space is. It's elemental. British imperial officials long before the American Revolution are thinking about the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence River and what they mean for empire and how they allow access into the continental interior and what kinds of diplomatic activity they need to do to access that space and to do so without starting a war, which is what they end up doing. And one of the things that they start to kind of acknowledge is that the French have done a better job of this. The French have just done a much better job of this, even though they have a much smaller footprint on the continent. They've understood that about themselves, and they've done the work of having, it's still an imperial relationship, but an imperial diplomatic relationship with the indigenous peoples of the Great Lakes region in particular. That's not to defend the French Empire or anything, but it means that the British are wrestling with this problem of a settler colonial enterprise that's predicated on give these guys land and clear space to do it. That's running into, we don't want to fight another one of those wars. So we have a compelling interest in making sure that the Native Americans that we deal with are living in a space where they're able to access the waterways that they've been living on in the first place. This is absolutely true along the New England coast. It's true in the Great Lakes. It's true in the Mississippi and Missouri River areas too. And that's ongoing. Think about struggles over water rights in the present. We just think of the West as land. But even in the continental interior, the indigenous peoples that lived in these respective areas live in a terraqueous environment. They would have to. They wouldn't have been able to eat, they wouldn't have been able to live without it. They would have been dependent on riverine history. And as some of these sort of discoveries are finding, they had continent-spanning trading networks. You don't get that just by traveling over foot. That means that they were living in kind of a watery environment. And I think if you start with that, you think about it differently. You just see space differently. If you're sitting there watching, what are these people in the Dakotas fighting about? Water. That's what they're fighting about. It's not just about drinking water. It's about what water means to a polity and a people and their sovereignty and their history, which is not basically the same thing in a sense. So I mean, that's kind of a vague answer to your question maybe, but part of it is I just want to put water at the center and see what that does. And I think once you do that, you can see, even thinking about the continent, thinking about Colorado and Missouri and all these spaces that we think of as about as far away from the ocean as possible, there's spaces that are overlaid with water, and that's why people are there. So you want to kind of think about that, not just because it's historically accurate, but because it helps us appreciate what's happening in the world today.
Okay, well, I think we're actually past the time we usually quit these. If there's no other, and I want to apologize for the people online, is that they just didn't quite get the equipment in the right place to actually see what the questions are. So we're still working on that. We had plenty of good questions. There was people writing in saying how much they like to talk. So let's just give Matt Crowe a big hand.